Hello everyone, welcome back to the darkness. Hospitals are places where life and death cross paths every second, leaving behind an energy that doesn't always fade away. Today, I'll share 3 terrifying stories that took place between white hallways and night shifts. Turn off the lights and get comfortable. Let's begin. My name is Elena, and I worked for 6 years on the night cleaning crew of a state hospital. When you work in a place where people die every day, you develop a kind of armor. You get used to the strange noises and shadows, and you ignore them just to finish your shift. But what happened to me in the oncology wing 2 winters ago forced me to quit the very next morning. It was around 3:15 a.m. That floor is especially heavy because most patients are sedated or very weak, so the silence is dense. I was polishing the long hallway that leads to the intensive care unit. It's a straight hallway with total visibility from one end to the other. As I ran the machine, I noticed in the reflection of the freshly waxed floor that someone was sitting in one of the waiting chairs at the far end. I thought it was strange because visiting hours are forbidden at that time. I stopped and turned off the machine. The figure was an elderly man, wearing a pale blue hospital gown and a brown blanket over his legs. His back was to me, staring fixedly through the window overlooking the dark parking lot. I figured it was a patient who had become disoriented and wandered out of his room. I approached slowly, calling out softly, "Sir, you shouldn't be out here, it's cold." The man didn't move. He didn't even tense up. I kept walking toward him, and when I was only 3 meters away, I saw something that made me stop dead in my tracks. The man wasn't sitting on the chair. His body was a few inches above the seat, floating in a rigid position, and his feet had no shoes, and the soles were completely black, as if he had walked on hot ash. Just as I was about to call for help on the radio, the man began to turn his neck backward. He didn't turn his body, only his neck, with a sound of dry bones snapping that echoed throughout the empty hallway. Before his face fully turned toward me, the hallway lights began to explode one by one, from the far end toward where I stood, plunging me into absolute darkness. I stood frozen in total darkness. The only sound was my own racing breath and the echo of shattered light bulbs on the floor. I didn't dare turn on my belt flashlight because, honestly, I was terrified of what the light might reveal in front of me. I pressed myself against the wall and began to shuffle sideways toward the nursing station, trying not to make a sound. Suddenly, I felt an intense cold, not the kind from an air conditioner. It was as if I had stepped into an industrial freezer. At that moment, I heard a whisper right in my left ear. It wasn't a clear voice. It was a raspy sound, like sandpaper, saying a single word, "Thank you." Terror gave me the push I needed. I clicked on my flashlight and pointed it at the chair. It was empty. There was no trace of the man, the blanket, or the black footprints. Suddenly, I felt an intense cold, not the kind from an air conditioner. It was as if I had stepped into an industrial freezer. At that moment, I heard a whisper right in my left ear. It wasn't a clear voice. It was a raspy sound, like sandpaper, saying a single word, "Thank you." Terror gave me the push I needed. I clicked on my flashlight and pointed it at the chair. It was empty. There was no trace of the man, the blanket, or the black footprints. I reached the nursing station almost screaming. The nurse on duty, a woman with years of experience named Marta, looked at me with an unsettling calmness. When I told her, trembling, that a patient was floating in the hallway and the lights had exploded, she wasn't surprised. She simply sighed, opened the logbook, and pointed to an entry from just 10 minutes prior. It was the death record for Mr. Aranda, from room 300 World 12. Marta explained that Mr. Aranda had spent his last 3 months sitting in that same hallway chair, looking out the window, waiting for a family that never came to visit him. He had died at exactly 3:05 a.m. The most terrifying part wasn't knowing I had seen a dead man, but what Marta told me next. Elena, the lights didn't explode. The electrical system is perfectly fine. Whatever you saw made your eyes stop perceiving the light. I quit that very instant. I couldn't go back to a place where the dead thank you for watching them die. Many people believe the hardest part of working in a morgue is the sight of the bodies, but they're wrong. The worst part is the sound. The refrigeration units have a constant hum that gets inside your head, and the metal creaks as it cools or warms. You get used to it, or at least I thought I did until I was assigned the inventory shift in the basement of the clinical hospital. My task was simple: verify the toe tags of the weekend admissions and cross-reference them with the digital files. It was near midnight. I was alone, or so the entry log said. As I walked with my tablet between the rows of stainless steel, I heard a sharp thud, clang, as if someone had struck one of the metal doors from the inside. I froze, thinking it was an air bubble in the pipes. But then it happened again. Clang, clang. It was coming from drawer number 14. I approached with my heart in my throat. According to my list, drawer 14 should have been empty. The patient who was there had been picked up by the funeral home that very afternoon. However, the temperature gauge for the drawer was dropping rapidly, much more than normal, showing negative numbers that made no sense. I reached for the metal handle. It was so cold it almost burned my skin. With a mechanical effort, I pulled the drawer out. It was empty, just as the paperwork said. I sighed in relief, thinking it was a thermostat failure. But when I tried to close the drawer, something blocked it. I looked toward the back of the dark compartment and saw a pair of small, white, wrinkled hands gripping the inner edge of the drawer, preventing it from closing. They were the hands of a child. There was no body, just the hands emerging from the darkness at the back of the wall, clinging to the metal with supernatural strength. And then, from inside the empty drawer, I heard a clear, icy, childish voice that made me let go of the handle. Is it my turn to come out yet? It's very cold in here. At that moment, the ceiling light began to flicker, and I felt something tugging at my lab coat, trying to pull me into the drawer. The tug on my coat was so strong, I nearly fell face first against the metal tray. I lunged backward, tripping over an empty gurney, while the sound of metal slamming against metal filled the room. The hands coming out of the darkness of drawer 14 didn't let go. They began to pull the tray inward with mechanical violence, until the drawer slammed shut with a crash that seemed to shake the hospital's foundation. I didn't wait to see anything else. I ran out of the morgue, sprinted up the emergency stairs, and didn't stop until I reached the security office on the ground floor. I was pale, sweating, despite the basement chill. The guard, an older man who barely looked up from his coffee, asked me what was wrong. When I managed to stammer that something had tried to pull me into drawer 14, his expression changed. He set down his coffee and pulled a yellowed envelope from a drawer under his desk. He told me that 15 years ago, this hospital had a ventilation system failure that caused a fire on the ground floor. A child who had gotten lost in the hallways ended up mistakenly locked in the morgue's refrigeration area while trying to hide from the smoke. They found him days later in drawer 14. The most terrifying part is that, according to the guard, the boy didn't die from the fire or the smoke, but from hypothermia because the system activated automatically. He asked me to check the log again. When I looked at my tablet, the inventory list I had verified minutes before had changed. In the row 4, drawer 14, where there had been nothing before, a name now appeared, written in blurry letters, as if they were wet, guest. That night, I quit my internship. Doesn't matter how much you know about medicine or science. There are places in hospitals that hold a physical memory of pain, and the cold of that morgue is something I still feel in my bones every time I enter a dark room. Working hospital security is boring 90% of the time. You sit in a dark room full of monitors, making sure no one smokes in the stairwells or that psychiatric patients don't try to escape. My post was in the I zone, an area that never sleeps. I had 16 cameras under my command, but number 9 was my favorite. It covered the main waiting room. A place full of human drama, people crying, people waiting for news. It was 2 in the morning on a Tuesday when I first saw him. On camera 9, the room was almost empty, except for a young woman sitting in the top left corner. She looked normal, wearing a red coat, looking at her phone. The strange part started when I looked at camera 10, which covered the same angle, but from the opposite side. On that screen, the chair where the woman should have been was empty. I thought it was a system lag, so I rebooted the video server. But when the images came back, the situation was worse. On camera 9, a tall man, dressed in an old-fashioned black suit and a top hat, was now standing right behind the woman in the red coat. He was so close to her he could almost touch her, but she kept looking at her phone, totally oblivious to his presence. The most disturbing part was that the man had no face. Where the features should have been, there was only a smooth, pale surface reflecting the fluorescent ceiling light. I frantically checked the rest of the cameras. On camera 10, the chair was still empty. On camera 11, which showed the entrance hallway, there was no one. Only camera 9 showed that figure. I started to break out in a cold sweat when I saw the man in the suit slowly raise a long, grayish hand, positioning it right over the girl's head, as if he were about to claim something that belonged to him. I couldn't just sit there watching that thing touch the girl. I grabbed my radio and called the guard patrolling the lobby. "Ramiro, get to the waiting room now. There's a guy harassing a woman in a red coat. Move." On the monitor, I watched Ramiro run into the frame of camera 9. I saw him pass right next to the girl and the man in the suit. He literally walked through them as if they were made of smoke. Ramiro answered over the radio, his voice panting. "There's no one here, boss. The room is empty." But on my screen, reality was different. The faceless man had placed both hands on the girl's shoulders, and she, for the first time, had dropped her phone. Her head fell back, and she began to open her mouth in what looked like a silent scream. The most terrifying thing happened then. The man in the suit slowly turned his head, not toward Ramiro, but directly toward the camera. Toward me. I felt my heart stop. The figure pointed at the camera lens with an excessively long index finger, and at that exact moment, the monitor for camera 9 exploded into static. I ran to the waiting room, forgetting all protocols. When I arrived, Ramiro was standing in the middle of the room, confused. There was no one there. No girl in a red coat, no man in a suit. But on the floor, right where she had been sitting, we found her mobile phone. The screen was on, showing an active call that had been running for exactly 4 minutes. I picked up the phone, and as I looked at the glass wall facing the street, I saw something that made me lose my balance. There were 2 handprints etched onto the glass from the inside, at the height where the girl's head would have been, but they weren't made of grease or sweat. They were prints of frost, ice engraved into the glass on a warm summer night. Since that day, I've understood that cameras aren't just for watching the living. Sometimes they are the only window we have to see those who come to collect the souls the hospital can no longer save. The next day, I requested a transfer to a shopping mall. At least there, the mannequins don't move. Or so I want to believe. Sometimes, hospitals hold secrets that medicine simply cannot explain. If you ever have to spend a night in one, remember, if you hear a whisper or feel a sudden chill, it's better not to look back. If you enjoyed these stories, don't forget to subscribe for more tales from the edge of reality. Good night, and keep the lights on.